So just to recapitulate where we are in the discussion, recall that chapter 4, the burden of chapter 4, was to show the specifically epistemological aspects of our claim that knowledge is all based on the Christian worldview. That with the Christian worldview, you have an epistemologically sound justification of knowledge, and without it, you don't. Then section 1 of chapter 5 that we did in the last video went on to explain that nevertheless epistemology as an isolated bubble is not sufficient because epistemology drags in metaphysics and metaphysics drags in ethics, and both of those drag in anthropology and the ethical situation, including salvation. And therefore, the apologetic approach has to be this much broader attack, even though epistemology is kind of the nub that we're trying to drive home. Now in section 2 of chapter 5, we have what he calls the antithesis in attitude and outlook. Antithesis in attitude and outlook. And here what he's trying to drive home is that having laid this groundwork of epistemology and then its nested nature with metaphysics and ethics, there's also a personal aspect, and that is that the unbeliever rejects that entire schema, and that rejection establishes what Bahnsen calls the antithesis. And that antithesis has both a personal aspect and a conceptual aspect. And as he gets through toward the unpacking that second part, he does what I think has the potential to be a useful taxonomy. Namely, he reduces the Christian worldview to a fairly short list of items or topics, which I think is helpful because if it's just this entire biblical worldview, well, what is that? Where does it begin and where does it end? But by listing half a dozen or so topics, we now have something very concrete that we can examine. And I think the potential is thereby laid out to answer the common objection, well, yeah, but you have to show all non-Christian worldviews, including hypothetical ones. And that could be a virtual infinite number. But by reducing it to a shorter list, I think the potential is there whereby we could reformulate the argument to show that there's actually a finite number of elements, each of which implies the impossibility of knowledge, and therefore once you've gone through the list, you've kind of completed the case. However, the question is whether the converse is true. Do these half a dozen items imply Christianity? Christianity implies them, but do they imply Christianity uniquely? So that's the type of question we'll have to wrestle with at some point. Okay, so jumping right into section 5.2, Bahnsen. Christians and non-Christians, to repeat what has been said earlier, have an epistemological disagreement with each other. Christians claim that all men know God. That is, they believe important truths about the Creator and directly apprehend evidence that justifies those beliefs. Christians claim further that God, as the Redeemer, has given a saving and self-attesting revelation of himself in the Scriptures, which is necessary to restore fallen man's rebellious mind and wayward reasoning. As usual, I'll add critical comments, not to be critical, but to just aid the viewer in doing a close reading. Because to do a close reading, it's important to wrestle with whether each thesis put forward has been adequately defended and objections properly defended against. And even just for understanding a passage, it's helpful to kind of dig into the soil and turn it over in your mind. And so here, as in one of the passages we read in the last section, Bahnsen seems to be limiting the aspect of verbal revelation to the salvific aspect alone. But I think we've shown earlier that the verbal encounter with God is necessary to account for self-consciousness as such, and indeed was present to all of humanity at each of its two origin points, Eden and post-flood Noah. And that verbal revelation percolated down in each of the three major races of men, at least to some certain point. It's held in our collective conscience, you might say. So it's not just limited to salvation, I would argue here. Continuing. Faith is thus prerequisite for a genuinely rational understanding of anything. And here, I would object that faith should have been defined a bit better, and that by tapping into faith in the connection with knowledge, and particularly in the current discussion of the Thomistic faith versus nature dichotomy, this could be misleading to state this way. In one reading, faith is required for the possibility of knowledge. But in another way, it's not. Well, I should say, in another way, faith is simply indicating the rational position and holding to it. So if we have this revelation, which they've shown we do, and if that revelation is the basis for all knowledge, there's a sense in which the only reasonable thing to do is to hold it. So as long as one's vision of faith is consistent with the fact that this is the only reasonable position to hold, we can take that. But then I'm wondering, what does the word really add? Unless he's using faith in sort of the objective sense of faith as the content of Christianity. In other words, kind of a one-word summary of the Christian worldview. You'd say the faith. Continuing. This is the evidence for the previous claims that men directly grasp the God-given evidence in nature for the Creator and in Scripture for the Redeemer. I'm not sure when he says this is the evidence, I'm not sure what the evidence is. So this first paragraph was a bit rough, but let's continue. But non-Christians reject these claims, asserting instead that Christians do not know these things to be true, that is, are not justified in what they allege, and or that certain things that men do know disprove the Christian position. So believer and unbeliever disagree with each other epistemologically. Here, the opening sally was good. We do have this difference. Non-Christians think we don't know these things to be true, or they actually think, the more aggressive ones think they actually know that some of the things we say are false. But that does not, I would argue, necessarily mean we disagree with each other epistemologically. That is, a disagreement as to propositions that being true does not necessarily indicate a difference in epistemology. For example, two empiricists might disagree with how they're interpreting some data to formulate a law of, say, gas pressure or something. So they disagree, but that doesn't mean they have different epistemologies. Continuing. Their dispute over epistemological matters, however, must inevitably be carried out in the wider context of the conflicting philosophical systems that coordinate what they maintain about the reality, ethics, and epistemology. According to presuppositional apologetics, within the worldview of the unbeliever, one cannot devise and sustain an intelligible account of human knowledge or rationality, whereas just such a grounding and rationale for epistemology is provided by the biblical worldview. Faith is the necessary foundation or framework for rationality and understanding. Well, there again, he's dropped in this word faith all of a sudden. And I think that adds more confusion than clarity, quite frankly. The proposition, you ought not to drive while drunk, is a deliverance of reason based on examination of history and statistics and so forth. But if you're standing there at the street corner drunk, thinking about getting in your car and driving, it's still the position of reason to choose not to get in the car and drive drunk. But in a sense, it requires faith at that point, because all of your current momentary instincts are to do the opposite of what you knew to be the case when you were in a saner moment. Maybe that's a good illustration then of how it is that you need faith, but faith is the reasonable position or the rational position, not the opposite of that. It's not like something picking up where reason left off. Now he starts picking apart this first point of the difference, the antithesis in attitude. Skipping a few lines, he says, to begin with, we can hardly ever forget, even if we sometimes overlook, the fact that interpreting the world, reasoning about life, and developing philosophical convictions are things done by persons, not by mechanical devices like computers. So there's the personal aspect. Personal qualities and factors, attitudes, desires, aims, prejudices, and defects will be operative in any expression of opinion, line of reasoning, system of thought, or interpretation. Because there is a fundamental moral and spiritual contrast between believer and unbeliever, one is seeking to glorify God and understand the world in the light of God's word, while the other is self-seeking and in rebellion against God's word, the way in which they reason and argue will manifest an antithesis in attitude. So he goes on to drive that home, and he uses Abraham Kuyper's distinction or indulgence of external or formal matters. So even though Kuyper was sort of the guy that invented this whole notion of antithesis, and a very radical antithesis, he carved out an area of neutrality for things that are external or formal. So for instance, weights and measures, how long an item is or how many pounds of flour, things that take place in the marketplace, those would be examples of an external matter. And a formal matter would be things like math, perhaps, where there's a mere form of logic but no connection to the world as such. So Bahnsen has a little discussion here where he points out that Kuyper, in one sense, didn't go far enough, and in another sense, went too far. And that's because we, Vantillians, say that in one sense, we have the whole world in common, not just externalities and formalities. But on the other hand, that's because the whole world is operating in terms of the Christian worldview at base, in terms of a tacit justification for what they're actually doing. So in that sense, the antithesis is so radical that it also includes mathematics and measuring and so forth. That leads to a distinction that he makes on page 276 between common notions versus common ground. There's a book or two that have come out in the last, 10 or 15 years attacking Van Til as denying common notions and arguing that, in fact, we have common notions with unbelievers. But Bahnsen's explanation down here, not in response to those books, but apropos those books, at the bottom of 276, Van Til's proposal, therefore, for a consistent method in defending the faith was that we no longer make an appeal to common notions, which Christian and non-Christian agree on, but to the common ground, which they actually have because man and his world are what Scripture says they are. So again, making the same point that was made in connection with Kuyper's distinction. In a sense, we do have common notions, but what we're trying to focus on is whether the unbeliever is justified in having those common notions. Do we have common ground? And of course, the whole apologetic is showing that we both do and don't. We do in the sense that he borrows it when he needs it, but we don't have common ground in that he won't accept it. Next, we come to a paragraph where he refutes the idea that the apologists can assume that there's not two positions, but three, namely either the Christian, the non-Christian, or the undecided position. And he's going to argue that the undecided position is not really possible, and therefore we really only have two positions, not three. So he says, page 277, in Van Til's perspective, as in Scripture as well, there are only two fundamental outlooks, the Christian and the non-Christian. Every method, the supposedly neutral one, no less than any other, presupposes either the truth or the falsity of Christian theism. One either has the mind of Christ or is an enemy in your mind. If you are not taught the truth in Jesus and renewed in the spirit of your mind, then you necessarily walk in the vanity of your mind. And scripture proofs from 1 Corinthians 2, Colossians 1, Ephesians 4, Romans 1, and Colossians 2 were cited to back those statements up. Footnote 39, Bahnsen. It is absolutely crucial that the transcendental argumentation begin by positing that Christian theism is either true or false. See chapter 7 below. Van Til's defense of the faith does not require the apologist to be aware of and refute every single variation of unbelieving philosophy, but only the presupposition common to them all, namely the rejection of Christian theism. Many apologists mistakenly imagine that there are really three options available. One may accept Christianity, reject it, or be undecided. But as Van Til recognized, to be undecided about the claim that Christian theism is the presupposition necessary to make sense out of any reasoning whatsoever is to begin one's reasoning on the operational assumption that this claim is false and can be laid aside as one proceeds to research and develop one's views. Since there are only two options at the most fundamental level, the truth or falsity of Christian theism as a presupposition, the refutation of the unbelieving one, in whatever illustration it appears, is an indirect proof of the other. So this is cracking the nut a particular way. The question is whether by showing the opponent's inability to account for knowledge, does that negation imply the truth assertion of the Christian position? Now, if they were true contrapositives, that would be the case. And here what he's shown, I think successfully, is that an attempt to establish a third position where we're just simply not decided doesn't make any sense, because the position, as was shown a number of videos ago as well, the non-Christian's position is in fact a denial of the Christian position. But I think what has not yet been shown here is whether the negation of the non-Christian worldview, of a particular non-Christian worldview, is enough to establish the positive truth of the Christian worldview just by itself, without more work needing to be done. Because the question is whether the negation of this entails Christianity, or whether there could be like a tertium quid, not the tertium quid of being undecided, but rather a different content, let's say a religion that, I mean, just to make it simplistic, suppose Mohammedanism looked like it could also serve this function of accounting for knowledge and so forth. We show that it doesn't, but suppose it could, just for argument. Then the question is whether we've really established what I'm going to call the uniqueness postulate of Christianity. And of course, that's the nub of the apologetic. But the apologetic, if it failed in establishing the uniqueness postulate, would still be doing some good work to showing the non-Christians' failure and the Christian worldview's success at accounting for knowledge. So I don't want to be dismissive, because even if that's all we did, that's still a huge accomplishment. But we'd like to push the ball over the goal line and do the uniqueness postulate, and I don't think Bahnsen's argument up to this point has established that quite yet. Okay, so now he comes to a several-page discussion, like I said in the intro, of kind of boiling down or distilling the Christian worldview into a finite list of topics that are set in opposition to the non-Christians' worldview. And so let's just go through that real quickly, because I think this is interesting. The first topic is personalism. The second topic is Random versus planned. The third topic is the source of authority. The fourth brings in the ethical. Is man innocent or guilty? And then fifthly, accounting for the origin of certain subtopics, such as logic, the general notion of what's possible or impossible, and the criterion of objectivity. Starting 2/3 down on page 278, he says, we begin by noting the personalism of Christian theism as a philosophical perspective grounded in revelation. Over against the impersonalism of non-Christian philosophical speculation. The Christian thinks about himself and about everything in the world as being intimately related to God. Skipping down to 10 lines down on 279. In him we live and move and have our existence, Acts 17:28. For non-Christians, none of that is relevant, certainly not from the outset of philosophical reasoning or interpretation. Speculation takes impersonal matter, particles, motion, physical events, natural laws, or whatever as the ultimate elements of reality, in terms of which we are to explain everything and guide our thinking and living. The universe is basically impersonal, and thus all questions that occupy our thinking are viewed as in an impersonal framework or context. So there he's taking the modern scientism perspective, materialistic, which indeed is proffered by the new atheists and most aggressive non-Christian apologists that aren't religious in our day and age, or the last century, let's say. But there was a school of philosophy called personalism that did posit a personal absolute, which Van Til also critiqued. In fact, he wrote, I believe, his PhD dissertation interacting with men of that persuasion. But I'm just pointing out that by saying that the non-Christian always begins with impersonal matter and motion doesn't cover the whole field. It just covers kind of the majority position right now. So it's still important because by driving home the necessity for the absolute to be personal, you do in fact knock over most non-Christian positions that you run into on the street. So only like a New Age mystic, perhaps, or someone that thinks that there's a God that's kind of suffused through all matter but is personal, they would need to go further in this list. Continuing down in 279, he's still on this first topic, but I wanted to make another point here. Things and events are simply what they are, with no need for or possibility of basic explanation. The facts are brute, that is, particulars unrelated to any plan or interpretation. The universe consists of purely random matter, moving completely according to chance. The connecting links between brute facts, whether concepts or laws, exist apart from God as abstract, impersonal, and apparently self-existent universals. So the point I was going to make here is that when Bahnsen and I think also Van Til reduce the opponent's position to an appeal to chance, it raises the question of whether a determinist is subject to that same censure. Like I used to have a philosophy professor that was a determinist, and he would occasionally make the statement, because of the Big Bang, everything is the way it is. So in other words, including your decision to take his class and be sitting in the class, all of that was determined at the moment of the Big Bang, where everything rippled down deterministically right down to the present. So I think you could head off that objection by replacing, when he says randomness, or rather when he says chance or determinism, because blind determinism might as well be chance from our point of view. So in other words, if my thinking is just determined by chemical processes, I have no more basis for relying on it than I would if it was based on chance. And it's interesting how this dialectic between chance and determinism takes place in the unbeliever's thought. So for instance, I had a uncle, I wouldn't call him an unbeliever, but he was quite liberal. But he was trying to carve out a area for human freedom against the powerful arguments for determinism that were hitting him not just from Calvinism, but from Newtonian physics and physics in general and the materialist worldview and so forth. So advocates of freedom feel that pressure coming from all sides. And he, along with others that I've read, thought he might be able to rescue free will because of quantum mechanics. But you see, that won't work because quantum mechanics says that the outcome of certain causality is literally random. In other words, flip of the coin. It could go this way or it could go that way. It gets more complicated. It's a certain probability per unit time as the universe evolves and so forth and so on. It's not just a flip of the coin, but that will do for illustration's sake. But you see, if you're picking blueberry pie versus apple pie is based on a flip of the coin, that also doesn't involve freedom in any meaningful sense. It just means it's taken it from the realm of strict causality to the realm of strict randomness. Neither one of those has freedom. Now, the second point of the control versus planning was actually wedged in this same discussion on page 278, where he says the Christian thinks about himself, this is about an inch and a half from the bottom, and about everything in the world as being intimately related to God, created, controlled, and pre-interpreted by him. Our aim is to know him better, to see his glory and wisdom worked out in the world, to respond in obedience and praise. The third point of the source of authority is the top of page 280. The Christian submits to the self-identifying, self-authorizing final authority of God for all he does or thinks. But the non-Christian takes for granted that this kind of authority belongs to himself. Man presumes to interpret and explain himself by his own internal principles and to give the original interpretation to the brute facts in a random universe. Skipping a few lines, the unbeliever assumes that man and the facts of his environment can't be understood intelligibly, whether or not there is a God who created the universe. And this is actually the nub of my objection to much of the natural law rediscovery that's taking place today. Because it seems to me that much of the natural law theory makes the same mistake, that we can understand ourselves and the universe whether or not God exists. Now, granted, the pious ones think that you can very quickly make deductions that God exists. But the point is the starting point treats that as a neutral question. God may or may not exist, but we know that our mind exists and that there are certain natural laws and ways of thinking about things. We'll have to get into that more later. The fourth point of innocent or guilty, middle of page 280. Finally, the unbeliever takes man to be morally innocent, even if as yet ignorant. He is certainly not, as the Christian worldview maintains, willfully blind, morally rebellious, and spiritually lost. Then he gets into the origin of logic, possibility, and objectivity. So the logic is dealt with in a fairly perfunctory way, but we've talked about that in much greater detail in earlier sections. But he says the presuppositionalist does not say that Christians and non-Christians inevitably accept and operate with completely different specific laws of logic in their practical exercise of reasoning. Yet they do clearly disagree with each other concerning the nature, source, and authority of the laws of logic. Both worldviews may endorse and utilize the disjunctive syllogism or De Morgan's theorems, But when we inquire into what they are talking about, the evidence that is appropriate or persuasive for their claims, or the necessity of the truths about logic, we get radically different answers, which almost always betray different convictions regarding metaphysics. Next, there's sort of an interesting discussion on what is possible. Top of 281. Similarly, both Christians and non-Christians seem to have similar concepts of possibility, or correspondingly impossibility, and the related idea of necessity. And yet the differences in their understanding of possibility turn out to be fundamental. Throughout the history of philosophy, the notion of possibility has been handled in various ways. Philosophers have first discussed conceptual possibility, but have disagreed on whether to understand it psychologically, that which is clearly conceivable, logically, that which is describable without contradiction, or linguistically, that which fits conventional usage, or whether to simply dismiss the notion as muddled and mysterious. Now, as far as conceptual possibility, I imagine that's where, say, an Arminian argues that God cannot have foreordained whatsoever comes to pass, because that would imply that he already knows what I'm going to choose, and knowing what I'm going to choose means that I don't have the power of contrary choice. And so his concept of what freedom of choice should entail dictates what is possible, namely whether God ordained whatsoever comes to pass, and therefore determines what is possible and not possible. The logical category, that which is describable without contradiction, I think is probably the most common definition. So in that sense, if there's no logical direct P and not P being asserted, then the state of affairs proposed is possible. So on that view, the nursery rhyme that speaks of the cow jumping over the moon would count as possible because there's no contradiction logically. Now, in terms of biology, anatomy, and physics, there might be problems, but not logically. Like a cow, there's no logical contradiction with the thought of a cow flexing her leg muscles, springing up and going up around the moon and coming back down. And I think that's one of the problems that I have with possible world semantics that only deals with logical possibilities. And then linguistically, the school of thought that justifies probability linguistically, I'm not familiar with. I mean, I imagine that it's just saying that if you can articulate with a semantically meaningful sentence a state of affairs, then that is what is a possible state of affairs. But I'm not familiar in more detail with that. Philosophers have also argued over a physical or nomological possibility, but have disagreed strongly on how to analyze something like a law of nature. So I think this is the category where we would argue that it's not possible for the cow to jump over the moon because he would lack oxygen, he lacks the ability in the musculature to gain escape velocity given the law of gravitation, inverse square law, and the law of gravitation. There would be no air for long enough to suffocate to death during that trip, and so forth and so on. In other words, trying to unpack why it's sort of silly and even obvious to us why the cow can't jump over the moon, why that's not possible, even though it doesn't seem to entail a logical contradiction. Events or truths have also been considered possible relative to some set of conditions. Accordingly, abilities or capacities are considered possibilities for achieving some effect under particular circumstances, described hypothetically or with subjunctive conditionals. So just, for example, if I were much stronger than I am, then I could bench press 500 pounds. The subjunctive conditional still survives in English when we say if that were the case, even though it's being slowly replaced with the simple past if that was the case. But I tend to think that just putting conditions in a subjunctive still causes the assertion of possibility to fall back on one of those previously discussed categories. Truths or states of affairs have likewise been spoken of as possible when the speaker is implicitly referring to our present state of knowledge, or the available evidence for such truths or states of affairs, which ironically makes possibility contingent, changing, or subject to degrees. But this is, in fact, probably the most common usage of possibility in ordinary language, because when we speak of the chance of flipping a heads or tails being 50-50, we mean that in terms of our present state of knowledge, namely, we don't have enough knowledge of the initial conditions to be able to predict whether it'll be heads or tails. But if we did have that knowledge, then we could predict it. So, for example, if you had a coin flipping machine, let's say, that was very precisely made to throw the same torque every time, and you knew the weight of the coin and how far it had to go to land, perhaps you could know with at least far greater than 50-50 probability whether it's going to be a heads or tails, depending on which way you lay the coin into the lever. So present knowledge is really the key to most probability, and therefore to what we consider possible. Think of the contents of a deck of cards from a gambler's point of view, the card counting. All of this is trying to use the increase in knowledge as cards are played to get a better and better sense of possibility. Bahnsen concludes, the important point is that throughout the history of philosophy, views on possibility have been strongly influenced by metaphysical convictions. For instance, about forms or ideas, essences, potentialities, laws of nature, determinism, the plenitude of being, God's freedom, the perfection of reality or the world, striving toward actuality, the uniqueness and discreteness of men's minds, various materialistic dogmas, or by an antipathy toward metaphysical discussion. Van Til did not address specific disputes between philosophers or contemporary debates regarding possibility, but he realized that Christians are committed to hold certain beliefs about possibility that unbelievers will reject. It is today more evident than ever before that it is exactly on those most fundamental matters, such as possibility and probability, that there is the greatest difference of opinion between theists and antitheists. Van Til was particularly keen to observe that abstract possibility must not be placed higher than God, a metaphor for asserting that God is not enveloped and does not have his source in a broader kind of possibility. Rather, there are no possibilities that are independent of him. The meaning of the word possibility is first determined by the God who has spoken to sinners through the book, the Bible. That and only that is possible which the God of the Bible determines. Well, I think this is incorrectly stated on one interpretation. So when he says that and only that is possible which the God of the Bible determines, if we say that I flip a coin and let's say it lands heads, that means that God determined it to be heads. As the proverb says, the lot is cast and God determines the outcome. But I don't think that's the same as saying that the opposite outcome is impossible, because I think the possibility of both heads or tails is baked into the meaning of the coin flip or the casting of the lot. So yes, it is determined by God, but that's not the same as saying that the opposite outcome was possible is incorrect. Skipping a few lines. Van Til detected subtle intellectual arrogance even in the way unbelievers treat possibility. The law of non-contradiction employed positively or negatively by man, assuming his own ultimacy, is made the standard of what is possible or impossible, both for men and for whatever gods may be. But on this basis, the Bible cannot speak to man or any God whose revelation and whose very nature is not essentially penetrable to the natural intellect of man. I'm reminded again of Fichte's first book, Fichte, which tried to lay out what qualities a revelation from God would need to meet to be acceptable to man's reasonable mind. So he trying to follow in the footsteps of Immanuel Kant, who was trying to unpack what transcendental intuitions of the aesthetic were necessary, as well as transcendental categories for the possibility of having an experience. Fichte tried to take that to the next step of deducing which categories any revelation would need to conform to in order for us to be able to accept it as revelation. And how ridiculous that is when you think about it. Because, of course, God can reveal whatever content he wants to. His prerogative as creator. So that, I guess, would be another example of kind of what Van Til is driving at here, as far as possibility. So I'll skip the rest of the possibility section, going down to the next topic, which is objectivity, and that's on page 283. Philosophers have typically sought to defend propositions that are true in a public sense, regardless of any particular's feelings or attitudes or beliefs. To collapse truth into personal belief, subjectivism, with the corollary adoption of relativism, has spelled death for the respectability and authority of philosophical reasoning. It's a bit confusing because he seems to be lining up philosophers as a team as upholding the same position that he's arguing for, namely that propositions, the truth of propositions needs to be maintained as objective, not subjective. But yet most of the team of philosophers are on the non-Christian side. Skipping down to the bottom of page 283. For Plato, objectivity exists independently of the will or expression of God, as well as independently of the world and man's experience of it, in a realm above both man and God. Man's mind participates in this transcendental ideal realm. Skipping a few lines, empiricists have disagreed with Plato's metaphysics, his epistemology, and not surprisingly, his view of objectivity. For them, objectivity is still centered in the mind of man, but now as it passively receives sensations and observes the facts. But Kant knew better than this. The reasoning mind is not in fact passive, but plays an active role in forming its ideas. For Kant, objects are partly a product of the mind's own activity, and thus he found the objectivity of phenomenal truth in the organizing activity of the mind, which stands over against and never knows in itself the realm of space-time factuality. Well, I think that's inaccurately stated there because he seems to be saying that the noumenal realm or the Ding an sich realm is the space-time factuality. But actually, it's just the opposite. The space-time factuality is on the phenomenal side and is the very thing that Kant says we do have knowledge of transcendentally. So I think this is an example of even Homer nods. The irony here is that Kant saved science and the objective universal validity of causation, for instance, by psychologizing it, by making it the result of what the mind imposes upon raw experience. Things have become so philosophically perverse that objectivity is saved by subjectivity. Well, as one with heavy sympathies with the German idealism, I don't take quite that dismissive attitude. I think that objectivity and subjectivity should be correlative. And if objectivity can be rescued by an analysis of the structure of subjectivity, so much the better. Skipping a few lines, Christians reject any idea that truth is subjective. Indeed, it would be selling out the Christian faith to defend it as only subjectively true, or to suggest that religious truth is a matter of one's subjective choices or feelings. Well, that's a false dichotomy, I would say, because you can say that the truth is subjective without saying it's only subjective. In fact, the truth should be subjective, i.e., incorporated into our mind as subjects. So they go into some infighting with this man named Beagle, who wrote a book called The Inspiration of Scripture that seems to move in this wrong direction of subjectivity. But I think we can plow past that. So finally, he comes in the concluding paragraph of this section, bottom of page 286, back to this kind of summary list of the Christian worldview. However, it kind of peters out and devolves back toward infinity with the magic etc. at the end. So let's listen. If we may summarize, the worldview of the Christian and the worldview of the non-Christian, the context within which their epistemological disagreements will be debated, subtly yet profoundly disagree with each other. There is an antithesis in philosophical outlook that touches on the personal or impersonal nature of both reality and reasoning, the random or divinely pre-interpreted, pre-planned character of events, final authority and value, the self-sufficiency of man's mind as an interpreter, man's nature and environment, facts, abstract concepts or principles, universals, logic, possibility, objectivity, etc. So he kind of loses some of the earlier structure at the point of the self-sufficiency of man's mind and leaves out this time, for some reason, the innocent or guilty, fallen or unfallen issue, and also leaves out the whole question of plurality and unity. So in my mind, he kind of ran out of steam in this last paragraph and failed to tie it back to a finite, rich, dense list of those elements that are necessary for a worldview and which distinguishes the Christian worldview from every other one. So I think what I've shown here is a pretty good list. And we need to leave off the etc. because once you put the etc. in there, now you open up like an unknown project and will be subject to the impossibility of the uniqueness claim. So with that, I'll stop because that's the end of the Bahnsen exposition of 5.2. Next time we'll go through the Van Til readings, and there's quite a few of them. I'll try to zoom to the extent that it repeats material that Bahnsen has already explained and just focus on those nuggets which are always seem to be very prevalent in Van Til's writings because of the fertility of his mind. So we'll go through those next time. I'll look forward to it. See you then.